Hey, welcome to another episode of On Mission with the Mindis. And today we are going to dive into one of the exciting things, and we get to share our life experiences with this topic called legalism.
Yeah. Big loaded word.
Yes.
Yeah. We have experienced it growing up. Legalism, even though it might seem like a very loaded word, and you might think, oh well, I don't think I've experienced that. I can assure you, you have.
Mm-hmm.
We all have. You probably don't know it's called legalism, and we will shortly define what legalism is. But it's been very much part of our culture, our personal lives, where we have experienced it being imposed by other people, but also developing our own legalistic practices, which have to be constantly brought into the light and submitted to Christ. But anyways, as we dive deeper into this whole topic of legalism, we've realized that it's one of the biggest reasons why people leave Jesus and his church.
Wow. Yes.
Because people just feel the weight of having to perform
Mm-hmm.
to earn God's favor. And again, portray this perfect picture at church or in community
Yeah.
so that we can belong, and we try to keep up with these rules even though we are like wearing out on the inside. And so because it's so close to taking people away from finding life in Jesus, I think it has to be addressed. And we see it's very prevalent, not just in the broader Christian culture, but I think even more so in South Asian culture. And we have plentiful of experiences as to how it manifested in many ways. Chris, do you have any experiences that you'd like to share?
Yes. Growing up, yes, I have a bunch of these experiences. Dad is a pastor. That means you get to do certain things just because they said. And then that means like, okay, this is the rule. You have to follow it just because you're a Christian. And one of those, many people can relate to me on that, is watching movies at a movie theater,
Oh, yeah.
which was a no-no for us. I mean, they said you follow. And the underlying part of that is because you're a Christian, you cannot do that. And there's no other reason. And then it's not that we haven't watched any at home. Yes, we did. Some on the TV. But going to a movie theater and watching movies is a big no-no.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Another area that I have experienced legalism is like reading Bible and then praying. And growing up, nobody would tell, why do you need to do this? It's just
Right.
that you do it.
That's true.
And now that we have grown out of it, and then we look into deeper meaning and the interpretation context and applying in the text. But growing up, you are just doing that same, like one chapter a day, 5 minutes of prayer, one chapter a day, 10 minutes of prayer. And those are some of the things that I have experienced. You just do it. And because you're a Christian, and you, by the underlying understanding of that is, if you do this, God is going to bless you, or you are going to get favor from God. That was kind of like ingrained
Right.
in us. And yeah, those are some of my experiences. And I want to ask you, Sarah, can you share some of your experiences very unique to you? Because even though we come from the same country, you grew up in a different culture, and my experiences may not be the same.
That's true. They're
Yeah.
actually not. And I think a lot of legalism can also be gender specific, because one of the things that was imposed at home and in a broader Christian circle was the way we dress to church. It's almost like you can dress differently Monday through Saturday, and then on Sunday, however, you have to dress church-like.
Yes.
Whatever that meant, a little more modest, or you wear your best clothes to church, and all of these things. And underlying modesty and giving your very best to God, whether it's clothes or whatever, is not wrong. It's almost like you can appease God because on Sundays, it's somehow that he's more holier. Or you're going to a place where you truly believe God is there, and so you have to dress a certain way. And I know of a few other churches and denominations that only wear white. And it's a whole list of things of how you need to dress up. That was one of the things that I experienced growing up, and also the kinds of food you would eat.
Yes.
Not all meat is permissible. You could only eat certain kinds of meat, and usually the backing for that kind of explanation is that eating certain kinds of meat was prohibited or sinful according to the Bible. It was, I believe, taken out of context in many ways, but it was very strictly followed. And I remember distinctly coming to the US and having to try different kinds of meats. And initially, it made me very uncomfortable because I've held some of these views growing up. And I think my parents, too, were very surprised to see me eat a lot of these things. And, Chris, I've noticed a lot of Christians around me who have come from a similar background still to this day don't consume certain kinds of meats because they truly believe it's going to hinder or, how they relate to God or how God views them.
Or they run out of God's favor if they start eating those kind of meats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Legalism can happen so subtly in our lives, in churches. It creeps in so slowly, you wouldn't even realize you're being legalistic or that the environment you're in is very legalistic. We think it's just us functioning and us doing the best we can. And Chris, every time I used to forget reading my Bible, or I did not feel like reading my Bible, or intentionally did not read it for that day, I would low-key worry that something is going to go really wrong in my day.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to come out of that mindset because essentially it somehow made me feel right with God. So if I did these things, like if I read my Bible, if I did pray, then somehow I was going to have a better day. Somehow my prayers were going to be answered. Somehow I was going to be blessed. So I held very strongly to some of those views for a very long time. And still, to this day, I will have to wrestle and ask what the motive is. But in simple terms, I would understand legalism as working for God's love versus being in God's love and acting out of that. But I'm sure you have a better definition.
Yeah. In fact, there are a couple of other faithful preachers. One for John Piper, he defines legalism as legalism is the conviction that law keeping is the ground of our acceptance with God. As if like only if we keep the law, God will accept us.
Yeah.
And other preacher, R.C. Sproul, he defines as like you are following a Christianity which is basically doing certain things and not doing certain things, like rules based. Do these, don't do these.
Yeah.
And he defines legalism in multiple definitions, 1, 2, 3. But basically, it tells us that you are following a God who is not gracious because you are only trying to follow these rules which are given by him. I mean, God in his attribute is gracious God. And if you're following the law that he has given, you're forgetting the gracious God, but you are wanting to follow the law that God has given, which is putting your works first than his grace.
Yeah. I do think in that same article, I remember him mentioning how we want to follow the law that's given by God, but we don't want God. It's like our devotion is void of the object of our devotion, which is a very sad reality, right? Because we don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
We honestly think it's helping our relationship with God, while the truth is we are running as far as we can.
Yes.
And Chris, every time that happened, I used to feel this weight, pressure, if you will, just so I can live up to that standard. And often I noticed that it would wear you out. After a while, you don't want to do it anymore.
True.
And again, I think there's a big distinction between being legalistic and being disciplined.
Mm.
Like we've discussed many times,
Mm-hmm.
loving God is not easy.
True.
But if it's coming from a place of knowing that his love for you is secure,
Mm.
then you love him differently, right? And so, yeah, there will be days where I don't want to read my Bible, but if I am confident of God's love, and if I'm confident that I don't have to earn his love for me to do this, I most likely, even though don't want to read my Bible, can at least go to him and share that with him and ask him to help me do it,
Yeah.
which is very different from a legalistic perspective, right? Chris, what are some of the effects you observed when somebody is very legalistic in your personal life, or what you've noticed with other people?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of changes that are happening once you get into that mindset of I have to do something to earn God's favor. One of the things is you cannot be real. What it does is you start putting a facade just because you want to show yourself that you are doing something by yourself to earn God's grace. And by doing that, you are telling the people around you that, hey, I'm set apart. I'm doing this. You guys are not doing this. That means you are putting up yourself more than what you are, and you're looking down on them. And what happens is, which is very much contradicting of how God wants us to live in a community, is build those relationships, live in a community, and live out the Christian life. You start to isolate yourself.
It's so true.
Because I am doing this, I don't want to put myself in among you guys, you people. I want to be set apart for my God because I am
Right.
depending on my works
Yeah,
in knowing God, in pursuing God.
that seriously affects our
Yes.
relationship with God and people.
Yes.
And I'm sure, like at the end of, I don't know, for however long you keep up with some of those things, you will become lonely. Going from a place of, I want to be set apart, to actually, I have nobody now.
Yeah.
Because, like you were saying, I think a very obvious outcome of legalism is judging others. Like we can't help it, right? Because you think you're living up to the standard, and now you begin to see all the people who aren't.
Yes.
Because to you, it's a serious conviction, and you think that's exactly how it's supposed to be. And somehow, everybody else is falling short. And I can 100% relate to that, because I can assure you, Chris, we're church planting. We want to invite everybody into God's kingdom, into our church. But if somebody dressed way differently than what I'm used to seeing at church,
Yes.
I cannot help it. Like it's so deeply ingrained that I am going to judge. At least a little bit, right? Like I'm going to look and say, who is this person? Maybe he or she is this way or that way, but like you said, I think it's not only the damage that it causes when it's imposed on us because of our culture, family backgrounds or church, but we can be legalistic ourselves, like
Yes.
very legalistic individually, not realizing that we have become those people.
Yeah, and there's this one apt text that can tell us the behavior and the outcome of what we are discussing here, and Jesus addressed it. And if you look at Luke, Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, it's a very short parable that Jesus talks about, and he talks about two individuals. One is a Pharisee. And just so you know, by definition, Pharisee literally means set apart.
How ironic.
Yeah, set apart. And the other individual that Jesus is telling about in this parable is a tax collector. So what this Pharisee is doing, they go to the temple and pray to God, and they are asking God for, they're supplicating God. And this Pharisee, he starts praying and he says, God, I thank you that I am not like the other man, the tax collector, and extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. So he's putting his kind of like position up and he is comparing himself in praying to God. And he
Right.
tells what he's doing, his works. What are those? Verse 12, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I get. So he's putting up his strict legalistic following rules of what he is doing as a
Yeah.
Pharisee. And on the other far end of that temple, this tax collector, he's praying. How is he praying? If we look at verse 13, he's standing far off, would not even lift his eyes up to heaven, but beats his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me. You can instantly see there's a contrast in how this legalistic behavior shows out when you start doing it, and down the line comes out and judging others. You
Yeah.
start to put your works first,
Yes.
than God's grace. And Jesus tells something very interesting here in verse 14. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified. Who is this man? The tax collector, who is beating his breast and asking for God's mercy, that because he is a sinner. And Jesus says, rather than the other guy who is the Pharisee, tax collector is more justified.
Yeah. As I'm listening to that story, Chris, I can't help but notice that the tax collector genuinely started to recognize he was a sinner.
Yes.
And I think legalism has a way of telling you that you're actually doing better.
Yeah. Yeah.
It kind of covers up the actual condition of our heart.
Yes.
So, in a way, you are immune to God's voice. You're immune to the Holy Spirit's work of actually shaping and transforming you
Yes.
because you think you've arrived, or at least you think you are better than all the other people who are going to get there. And it's very interesting because if works cannot measure up, I'm sure this Pharisee would be dealing with a lot of guilt.
Yes.
And probably beating himself up because he failed miserably, and that I'm sure he would be convinced that he's not worthy of God's love. With all of that being said, I do think God has a way of answering this serious situation within the church culture, especially
Yes.
South Asian culture. And I think the bigger question that has to be addressed is, can you love God without doing it legalistically?
Yeah. That is a big question. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a hard question to ask. Because how am I supposed to love God if I am falling short on all of these things? Right? But that is a conversation we are going to have in our next episode.
Yes.
And we will dig deeper into Colossians and Galatians and maybe even some Romans just to hear Paul
Yes.
talk about it. Because if there's anybody who is as legalistic as they can get with their faith,
Oh, yes.
Paul had it. So we will dive in deeper into that in that episode, because we didn't want to rush or stuff all of it into like one episode, because legalism in itself, establishing what it means, is a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. And we have experienced it.
Yes. We are learning the healthy way of pursuing God. Even though it's subtle in some ways. Even for me, I mean, when I was thinking, we were trying to discuss about this episode, it was hard to come up with, okay, what parts of the culture that I grew up are legalistic. It's so subtle because you don't think, because you've been in that culture for a long time, and some of us are still continuing to be in that. But you have to think deep, like, what is a healthy way of pursuing God?
Yeah. I think, like you're saying, I think the first step is recognizing that there's a way to pursue God, and loving God is not burdensome.
Absolutely.
And following God is not burdensome. And He did not design the relationship to be that way. Nevertheless, every relationship that's worth pursuing and investing in takes time and effort.
Yes.
But if loving somebody becomes a chore, then we need to ask what's going on.
Yeah. God didn't mean it to be that way.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for joining us, listening to this podcast. A very important question. And also continue to listen to our new podcasts that come up. And also give us your feedback.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this, we want to hear from you and any other questions that you want to hear
Absolutely.
discussed. And especially from a South Asian perspective, how faith and culture kind of like contradicted each other, or should they, or where have you seen certain things that you would wish somebody would address this?
Yep.
I'm not saying we are experts, but we would try faithfully to expose and then understand
Yeah.
so that we can discuss and apply.
Yeah. And our goal, like we've always mentioned, is we want to see communities change. We
Yes.
want to see individuals change. And Chris and I are hardcore believers that this change begins with you and me. Right? I think if we start identifying and addressing what's going on in our culture, then we can create healthy families.
Yeah.
And healthy families, when they congregate, they tend to create healthy communities.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and we will join you next time with a new one. Stay tuned.